Saturday's UFC Fight Night in the Big Easy featured 10 finishes, including the return of the H-Bomb. Welcome in to MMA Live Extra. I'm Phil Murphy. Dan Henderson recorded his 31st career win by knocking out Tim Boetsch 28 seconds into the main event, the second fastest finish of Hendo's storied career. To break down the fight, we welcome in our ESPN MMA reporters Brett Okamoto and Reed Kuhn. Brett, we'll start with you. They say the last thing a fighter loses is his power. What did you think of 44-year-old Henderson's performance?
I thought it was a great night for the H-Bomb, for Dan Henderson. Obviously, the storyline coming into this fight was, should Dan Henderson even be in the octagon anymore? Should he be fighting at the age of 44? And I think that those were valid questions to be asking. You know, Dan Henderson is one of the absolute best mixed martial artists to ever step into a cage. So what that means is when his skills start to decline, it's very noticeable. It's very clear that this guy is not quite the same fighter he was in his 30s. So I think the questions related to, is it a good idea for him to be fighting anymore, they are valid based on how he's looked in his last performances. But this one, you know, the right hand, he's still got it. I think Dan Henderson will have that right hand when he's 80 years old, let alone 40 years old. If an opponent gives him the right hand, they're going to go to sleep, and that's what Tim Boetsch did. Credit Dan Henderson for finishing the fight, but I thought Boetsch teed him up pretty well. He walked into that right hand, and when Henderson gets a guy hurt, he's going to finish him. We know that. It doesn't matter how old he is.
We saw Tim Kennedy call out Henderson on Twitter. We'll see if that fight materializes down the road. Let's bring in the author of Fightnomics, Reed Kuhn. Reed, in your book, you discuss the difference between the UFC's larger cage and its smaller cage. How much did the heightened finish rate Saturday, how much was that due to the use of a smaller cage in New Orleans?
Well, we rarely see the small cage, but the UFC is using two different sizes, and the 5-foot difference in diameter may not seem a lot, but it actually translates into a lot more area in the large cage, 44% more area. So the small confines of the cage that they used in New Orleans, we're seeing a trend here, and we're seeing a lot more finishes, and it's both knockouts and submissions that we're seeing elevated in the small cage. We're seeing a finish rate go from, you know, roughly half of all fights to more like 2/3 of all fights. So it appears to be a sizable trend, and the theory is that it's not because they're throwing more volume, it's just that hurt fighters have nowhere to run. It's easier to cut off your opponent and finish them once you've got them hurt.
Brett, we'll come back to you. In the co-main event, Ben Rothwell went heel turn after his first-round submission win over Matt Mitrione. What are your thoughts on Big Ben's performance both in and out of the cage?
You know, Ben is getting people to take notice of him, and that is the name of the game in this sport. You got to win, and you got to do it in a way that garners interest, and that is what Rothwell is doing. And quietly, this guy has won 3 of his last 4 fights. He's getting finishes. He's finished Brendan Schaub. He's finished Alistair Overeem. Now he's finished Matt Mitrione, and it's impressive. And then his outside of the cage antics, they're a little weird, they're a little awkward, but they're memorable, and that's what you want to be in this sport. And Ben Rothwell, I think he called out a perfect opponent in Andrei Arlovski. Arlovski is a guy who's a bit surprising. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be putting together a UFC title run. Neither was Rothwell, but here these guys are in their late 30s putting together these runs. And I think a fight between the two would be stylistically pleasing, and it also could produce a #1 contender. I think there's a little bit way for Ben Rothwell to go before he climbs into a cage with a guy like Cain Velasquez, but he's getting closer, and that was something that we were not expecting out of him.
And we know the UFC doesn't hate the idea of a marketable heavyweight, even if it's a guy who takes on a bit of the villain role. Gentlemen, thanks for the insight. For all things UFC, check out the MMA page here on ESPN.com. For Brett Okamoto and Reed Kuhn, I'm Phil Murphy. Thanks for watching MMA Live Extra.